Great. Good morning and good evening to all guests and participants around the globe. I am Pamela Gopo, representing the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD, and will serve as your moderator for this session. On behalf of JICA Ogata Research Institute and AUDA NEPAD Policy Bridge Tank, we extend a warm welcome to you at the book launch titled Policy Learning and Industrial Development and the Role of Development Cooperation. The JICA Ogata Research Institute focused on strategic promotion for sustainable development, emerging development challenges, and to respond to the priorities of challenging international communities formed the basis of the publication of this book. The AUDA NEPAD Policy Bridge Tank fundamentally serves to leverage on knowledge capitalization through expert intellectual capital and new knowledge, and also serves as a conduit to African member states, practitioners, and policymakers to share and disseminate knowledge as per our mandate. While Africa and the world is yet to fully recover from the socio-economic repercussions which came out of the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, the current Russia-Ukraine conflict presents another major setback. Therefore, it is indeed a very timely topic in addressing the great challenge to Africa's industrial transformation and global development through the lessons expanded in this book. The book is available for free and can be downloaded from the JICA Research Institute website. Industrial development is key. It's a key driver of structural transformation in developing countries. It generates sustained income, creates productivity and decent jobs, and promotes a knowledge spillover and technological innovation. AUDA NEPAD, as Africa's development agency, realizes the need to build African industries, and this publication reflects on Japan's succession through industrialization and modernization. Japan was the first Asian nation to industrialize faster than many European countries, and by extension, Japan provided support to the economic transformation of other ASEAN countries. As we listen and learn from these unique experiences with industrialization through the JICA Ogata Research Institute's policy-orientated presentations on the challenges faced by developing countries, and demonstrate Japan's intellectual support to the international community, specifically Africa, it will certainly contribute to this knowledge sharing platform today. We will now hear from our speakers. We will be presenting specific chapters of the book, and it is my privilege to introduce our first speaker, Professor Izumi Ono, who is a professor at the National Graduate Institute of Policy Studies and senior research advisor to the JICA Ogata Research Institute in Japan. Professor Ono will provide an overall introduction on the book and what matters on industrial development, and which combination of industrial policy instruments is appropriate in different circumstances given sector-specific characteristics. Professor Ono, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Pamela-san, and thank you very much for these opportunities. Okay, so let me start sharing a screen. Okay, so can you share? Okay. So my name is Izumi Ono. It is my great pleasure and honor to have our first book launch webinar co-hosted by AUDA NEPAD and Policy Bridge Think Tank together with a distinguished expert. So I'm so grateful for these opportunities. So as a first speaker, let me share with you the overview and also key concepts and the finding of this book, Policy Learning for Industrial Development and the Role of Development Cooperation, which was co-edited by myself and Amatsu-san and also Professor Hosono. Okay. So this research project title shows that this research overall aims at analyzing Japanese experiences of industrial development and development cooperation from the perspective of translative adaptation process. This translative adaptation is a key concept, overarching concept of the entire research, which means briefly the learning and introducing foreign models with indigenous local perspective. But I will explain more in detail later. So this practical research aims at serving as maybe reference for many policymakers and also practitioners. And we have 3 thematic areas: industrial policy, this is about this book, and also quality and productivity improvement, Kaizen in Africa, which will be launched later in the 27th of April. And then we are currently working on skill development. So about this specific book of policy learning for industrial development and the role of development cooperation, this looks into the role of industrial policy in promoting structural transformation of catching up economies, particularly through learning and also translative adaptation process. As Pamela-san said, that the industrial development is a key driver of structural transformation. In addition, new emerging landscape, like a much more complexity, and also broadening the scope of industrial development, like digitalization, SDG, building resilience in the post-pandemic recovery, etc. All these urge for the former importance of strengthening the policy capability of industrial development. So there are growing attention to the practical aspects of industrial policy making. And then we believe there are potential usefulness of Japanese experiences because of our own industrial catch-up experiences. And also Japan is one of the few donors which have extensive development cooperation in industrial development, including industrial policy support. So this is the entire book of the 11 chapters by 8 authors. It is consists of the 3 parts. First part is that the role of industrial policy in promoting learning and translative adaptation. And then today, after me, Mr. Amatsu is going to talk about the chapters 4 and 5 related to Japanese experiences. And then part 2 is about how can development policy support, which is a type of Japanese intellectual cooperation for industrial policy support, can facilitate this translative adaptation. And then part 3 is about the future or emerging trend, which will be explained by Mr. Honma in the chapter 10 particular. So let me talk about the highlight of my part of the overview and also key concept. This is what I'm going to talk about. Okay. So let me start with why it is important for policy learning for industrial development. Okay. We define industrial policy to cover both horizontal and also vertical policies. Vertical policy means promoting specific industrial sectors. In the past, vertical policy was a point of controversy, but there's a changing nature of the policy debates toward increasing recognition of the balanced approach. And also, I don't think there's no more heated debate of whether to adapt or not industrial policy, more interest in how to make industrial policy making implementation effective. That kind of practical aspect is now receiving high attention. And then particularly when we look at the African context, there's a growing interest and needs of particularly AU Agenda 2063, really talk about the importance of structural transformation and industrialization. And even before the strategy for implementation of the plan of action for the accelerated industrial development for Africa, this is exactly implementation of practical strategies. And then ongoing African Continental Free Trade Agreement, this is very important, but without industrial development, I think ongoing efforts to boost connectivity will be insufficient because I think only connectivity enhancement may, without the capacity development of the industry, the country may just end up with that flooded of the import in the market. So domestic value creation is very much important. So in this light, when we look at the industrialization challenge in Africa, of course, we face many challenges and shocks, including COVID and also recent maybe energy food potential crisis triggered by Ukraine crisis. But we have to tackle the fundamental basic issue for structural transformation. This table comes from the World Bank income classification based on our analysis. Over the past 30 years, we can see that many countries upgraded from low income country category to maybe middle or upper or high income categories. But most of the countries which now belong to high income countries are East European countries, which are disintegrated from the former Soviet Union bloc, or some Latin American countries, East Asian countries. Lamentably, the 29th countries are still low income countries, of which 23 countries are sub-Saharan African countries. And then 20 of them have never moved up. So it is very important to think about that the structural transformation tackling the basic issues. Here, let me explain the several key concepts. Okay. So transformative adaptation and local learning for industrial catch-up. Catching up is a process of learning to narrow the knowledge gap. I think Joseph Stiglitz, he talked about how important that the learning is for development, particularly localized learning for knowledge creation. Here, we want to refer to the concept of translative adaptation, which is originally anthropological maybe terminology that created by Professor Maegawa. He looks into the interaction between indigenous culture and also maybe foreign dominant culture and how they interact. But we want to utilize this from the maybe developmental perspective, particularly policy learning, which consists of, in our view, the 3 stages of building internal mechanism for learning. Okay, that is a learning, adaptation, and also scaling up, and maybe further innovation. A learning stage include collecting various information for relevant policy from abroad and to think about what is most suitable to your countries, and then analysis and studies. And then adaptation include experimentation and monitoring carefully what works, what doesn't work. And then you can scale up, institutionalize for the based on that experimentation. So this systematic approach for learning is very much important for building internal mechanism. At the same time, we think that there are several key ingredients, such as looking at the uniqueness of each country potential, country ownership, and also process orientation. Allowing trial and error is very important. This diagram tries to look at how translative adaptation works in the context of industrial policy making. Professor Hosono in chapter 2 discuss that the common key area of industrial policies. These can be considered as a maybe horizontal policy area, but it is also important how to prioritize these measures, and also to which sectors or industry you would like to introduce those things, and what are the specific maybe instrument, how other countries have been doing. So concretely thinking about these things require that perspective of translative adaptation. Okay. Also, to do it, make it implementable, you need that the vision, prioritization, and thinking concretely that the instrument and implementation, looking at the what's happening in the real sector and industries, in understanding the private sectors. Another concept which I want to emphasize is a dynamic capacity development and ingredient approach as a Japanese perspective. Often it is said that we should not implement industrial policy because the capacity is very weak, but it's a bit static approach. Rather, we would like to propose dynamic capacity development approach, which is about step-by-step learning through concrete, maybe learning by doing hands-on experiences. And then you will have applied based on achievement. And then you will think about possible future paths unique to each country's potential. So we consider this is a learning dynamic process. Government may be a problem, but at the same time, solution. Here, in this sense, we respect that approach proposed by Professor Yanagihara, Takushoku Universities. He talked about the ingredient approach, looking into the real structure of the economies, field orientation, which could be complementary to the framework approach, which looked into the global norms, and then maybe ranking the country where you stand. That is very important. Complementary, but ingredient perspective is also necessary for dynamic capacity development. This is just to show that the diagram, how maybe translative adaptation process can work through the learning by the government from the foreign knowledge for the policy, and also how government can, through industrial policy, to empower various actors so that society as a whole can enhance their capacities. So with this perspective, we have a various questions, and then those questions have been addressed by each chapters. For example, how have industrial policy contributed to promoting transformation through translative adaptation process? How did learning and dynamic capacity development takes place in early industrializers? What are the key factors that contributed to fostering societal learning? What are the basic issues to be learned? And how development policy support worked? Because of the time constraints, I wanted to explain all of the chapters, but let me summarize 5 key findings from the selected case studies of the part 1. Number 1 is the diversity of the development strategies, and then which use a mix of both horizontal and also vertical strategies. I think in East Asian typical industrialization experience that flying geese or the manufacturing export led growth. At the same time, other chapters see the various cases like Brazil, which have made a transformation through food value chain through soybean industry, or Chile, which has been very much successful in salmon industry, which never existed before, or Malaysia, not only automotive industry, but also successfully developed the palm oil industries. But to do it, the mindset of leaders in the government and the private sector are important, as will be explained by Mr. Amatsu in Meiji and post-war World War II, like Korea too. And then core agency is to be in charge of industrial policy making and implementation with understanding of the real sector of the economies, and also maybe providing public goods for like a R&D, the technology for when the market failure may take place. And then those organizations can also work with private sector closely. So those are fundamentally important. And then learning as a dynamic process. Even Japan, we had the learning and the trial and error process in Meiji era. This is a diagram of how core organization worked. Maybe I will not explain detail in Japan because Amatsu-san will be talking about, but in the case of METI, it has a broad mandate, and then it has a both vertical and also horizontal industrial policy, and then industrial structure council with stakeholders initiative have in charge of vision making. And then Brazil is a bit that the mixed experiences. It has a success at the same time failure in industrial policy making. But when successful cases happened, then National Development Bank had a very important role to play in interpreting political priorities and also sensitivity with the frontline technology, and also coordinating with the budget authorities in coming up with particular the instrument based on deep understanding of the business sectors. So these are fundamental importance for the Brazil in successful development of the steel sector and also airplane sector, etc. Maybe I should skip this part because I don't have a time to explain detail about how Japan has developed working on the industrial policy support, but maybe I can answer if some question arise. So let me summarize. So as I said, there are different policy content and distinctive learning process and diversity in industrialization strategy which are available, which is that the translative adaptation. And then government can act as a learner and those facilitators. In this translative adaptation process, systematically, it is very important to have stages of collecting information and also comparative analysis for adaptation, and then building mechanism for institutionalization. And then methodology should be learned, vision setting, and mindset of it very important. And then development cooperation could play a very instrumental role. Last slide is about how translative adaptation can work in today's context. Maybe Honma-san can explain more in detail, but even now, I think translative adaptation, the lens is even more important because the digitalization age, new knowledge and technology available more easily in a very much standardized format quickly. And also policy scope of industrial development is very much broadening and also speedy. So this really requires a lot of adaptable capabilities and also decisive policy action in consultation with stakeholders. And also Japan have to learn a lot, adapt itself in the post-pandemic world, and also changing maybe relative role of Japan in the world and the Asian economies. This is why I really appreciate that AUDA NEPAD is hosting this knowledge sharing activities, including the perspective of the recent industrializers and sharing this industrializing experience. But I hope Japan can contribute from the perspective of translative adaptation. So thank you very much for my initial presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ono. We're also very happy to learn with you, and thank you for the very comprehensive overview explaining key concepts and the fundamental findings, particularly the industrialization challenges. So thank you very much for that. Our next presenter is Professor Amatsu, a professor of the Faculty of Economics at the Yamaguchi University in Japan. And he will present from Japan's experience on how industrial policy should look in industrialization processes from the perspective of the Ministry of Industry. Professor Amatsu, you have the platform. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So my name is Kuniaki Amatsu. So visiting professor for Yamaguchi University, but now so JICA. And I will move into JICA UK this May. Thank you very much, distinguished guests and prominent speakers, and thank you very much, Ms. Pamela-san, nice moderator, and JICA colleagues. Okay, let me introduce, let me start my presentation. My presentation is about Japanese experience, as Professor Ono said. So how should the industrial policy and the Ministry of Industry look like in industrialization process? So I'd like to introduce chapter 4 and 5 very briefly. So I guess many African leaders and policymakers have several questions. For example, how can they progress industrialization, and how can they involved in that process, and how should the state facilitate industrialization look like, and so on. These two chapters, so chapter 4 and 5, tells us the answers. This is the today's contents. And chapter 4 is about role and characteristics of Japanese industrial policy in post-World War II, post-war Japan. This is written by Professor Wada. This chapter tells us how industrial policy should look like, and the Ministry of International Trade and the Industry, MITI, could make itself work better, because ministry in charge is very key, I think. And in the case of Japanese MITI, Ministry of Industrial Industries case, so they experiences the many policy changes of policy agenda after World War II. For example, since end of World War II and mid-1950s, their main issues is about reconstruction and development, and mid-1950s to early 1970s, preparation for trade liberalization, and 1970s, they encountered new issues. For example, industrial upgrading and pollution and balanced development across the nation's regional development issues. Then, important things in this Japanese MITI is they could respond these policy changes and very flexibly. They accommodate their policy agenda in each conditions. And so regarding the industrial policy, sometimes Japanese industrial policy, I talk about like a vision-oriented and also very strong intervention in the economies. But the reality is not such kind of things. Right? Japanese industrial policy is indicative basis, presenting the vision to the stakeholders, including the business sectors and so on. Then they are not directive, but indicative. And so this vision is fully shared among the government, politicians, and the business sector and people. That is very important things. So this shared vision to make itself to perform better for industrialization. And also, as Professor Ono said, so this So sectoral policies, very important. Of course, many people argues, so Japanese Ministry of Industrial Policy is characterized by sectoral policy. But another important thing here is they are not relying on only sectoral policies. They are based on market mechanism. That's a very important issue. And what is a key factor for this Japanese industrial policy and meetings? So I raised 3 points. So first point is, so meetings official has a strong desire to revitalize Japanese economy after World War II. They're really fully committed, and they really so tried to serve themselves for revitalization of Japanese economy after World War II. Second important thing is meetings organizational structures. As Professor Ono said, so their organizational structure are composed of two parts. One is the vertical bureaus, and the second one is horizontal bureaus. They created some synergies. So under this organizational setting, and under this organizational settings, MITI official every time look at industry, not just sitting on the desk and in the office. They try to communicate with the private sector people very often in one way or another way. A second thing is cross communication with business sector, thereby effective policy designing and implementation through deliberative council and so on. And also, so frank policy debate was made, and also bottom-up policy planning process was ensured in accordance with guidance of leaders, political leaders. Then, through this organizational setting and exercise, they tried to obtain policy making and designing know-how. And so under this setting, they could also accumulate industry-specific knowledge within ministries. Within ministry, this is very important issues. And also under this accumulation efforts, so engineering technocrats play very important roles. In that sense, so not only economists and legal people, but also engineering technocrats. Their presence is very important. I'll skip this. Chapter 5 is about Meiji eras. Meiji is Japanese unique era system. So usually Meiji covered late 19th century to early 20th centuries. So this chapter is about learning process of state leaders and ministers of industry in these eras, written by myself. So when I wrote these chapters, I assumed two typical failures in developing countries in the industrialization process. So first typical failure is ambitious industrialization efforts. I assume this is a vision issue. Second typical failure is uncertainty, less predictability, and consistency of policy framework and implementation. Thereby, these problems create some harmful policies for production sectors. I think this is a policy making practices issues. So this table is a contrast between ideal status and reality in the initial status in terms of vision formulation and policy making practices. In the case of the vision formulation issues, so ideal status is it should be formulated based on reality of the industrial sector at the time. But usually, so in developing countries, in particular, early industrialization stages, the reality is like this, based on, so it will be formulated, so based on euphoria or illusion or desire of state leaders or sometimes policy makers. And in the case of policy making practices, so ideal status is policies made based on reality of the industrial sectors or industrial entrepreneurs from the view of industrial entrepreneurs. But the actual situation in the initial state of the industrialization is like this. Policy is based on the thoughts of the state leaders, the MOI from the state views, not so industrial entrepreneurial views, and sometimes so with paternalistic good views. Therefore, so I think so between the initial stage and the ideal stage, there's some gap. So industrialization and the state learning process is the process for reducing the gap. Then in the case of successfully industrialized economies, so as time goes by, so this gap will be reduced gradually. But failed or stagnant economies case, they could so fail for gap reduction smoothly, different from successfully industrial economies. So in the case of the Meiji Japan, so late 19th centuries to early 20th centuries, so sometimes so Meiji Japan was characterized very favorable initial conditions since the pre-modern era. For example, the higher education status and the better and functioning administrative system and so on. But the other fact is so industrialization from the scratch because they did not have any modern sector at the time. Therefore, so Japan as well so followed this gap reduction process, as I show you. So I do not deeply into this this slide, but Meiji Japan can be divided 3 parts. So Ministry of Engineering era, Ministry of Home Affairs eras, and Ministry of Agriculture Commerce eras. So firstly, so in the Ministry of Engineering eras, so vision was formulated euphoria based, but so Ministry of Home Affairs case, so euphoria and reality based, this is a hybrid. But finally, so they could so introduce so reality-based vision formulation. And through this transition period, they experienced many trial and errors process and also so heavy so fiscal deficit. And in the case of Japan, for reducing the gap from the initial stage to the later stage, they spent around 30 years. Therefore, so how can we so compress this? How can you so this period shorter than 30 years? This is a very important issue for current industrialized countries. And key factor for gap reduction is so I divided 2 parts: internal factor within government and external factor outside government. So as in the case of internal factor within the government, I can base so degree of industry interest and seriousness of state leaders and ministers of industry in industries. They are very keen to industrialization and industry issues. And also they have very strong aggressive appetite of studying and understanding industries. And also they try to experience manufacturing by themselves on the ground. And also they created the pool of engineering technocrats, thereby accumulate industrial knowledge within Japan, within government. And also, so economic rationality so matters, but it did not exist in the early stage. So between the period starting the creating some pool of engineering technocrats and so later stage, they should have some gestation period. But this gestation period, they also encounters some macroeconomic imbalance and so on. But so finally, so they are sensitive to this error correction factors, and they could finally so handle the industrialization process relatively prudently. This is very important issues. An external factor outside the government is the presence of vigorous private sector. This is an actor so to urge government to turn its face to private sector for shifting to private sector views. This is also very important. And what apply Japanese experience to Africa? So I divided so several parts. So first one is building basic stance. So strong interest and seriousness toward industrialization of state leaders and ministers in charge. This is very important. Reality-based with private entrepreneur views, not state views, and efforts of building trust with private entrepreneurs in the long run. Sometimes many people raised manufacturing-oriented industrialization is still valid currently, so servification, digitization. So whatever they want, so these key factors need to be kept. This is very important. And so actions for the moment is I would suggest the people to study industries and to make efforts of knowledge accumulation for the industry within the government. So regardless of manufacturing and other issues, and also not only economists, but also specialists. In the case of Japan, that was the engineering technocrats. So main purpose of this is so government and ministry in charge needed to be able to talk with that production sector by using common language and logic and an organizational setting, also very important. So finally, I raised one point: manage the industrial process very prudently during the gestation period and using the financial disciplines. when we look at the failures or stagnant case of industrialization in the past history, so many countries commit some failure during this gestation period. Therefore, they should be or we should be sensitive to error correction factor. That is very important. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very, very much, Professor Amatso, for highlighting particularly the accumulation of industrial knowledge and skill within a government, and government playing a critical role in the aspect of policy-making practices, as well as, very importantly, the interactive communication between the state and industrial entrepreneurs, which is a very important role. We also acknowledge, after your presentation, that Japan, having spent 30 years of history on industrial development, are certainly the pioneers of industrialization. Thank you very much, Professor Amatso. Our final presenter, Mr. Homa, is the Senior Advisor at the Economic Development Department at JICA, and he will present on the policy learnings and industrial development and the role of development cooperation. Mr. Homa, over to you.
Sorry for that. Sorry. So thank you very much, Ms. Pamela. My name is Toru Homa from JICA, and I'm a senior advisor on industrial and private sector development. Let me share my screen first. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. So as the previous speakers suggested, my role is working on the chapter 10. So this is talking about now and future for the industrial development. The title is Contemporary Agenda on Industrial Development and Policy Support to Developing Countries. So next, as Professor Ono highlighted for the future, so there are a lot of the changes which we have to consider. So I really summarizes the changes. Actually, it's a lot of many changes. So summarizes as 4 groups as a major contemporary megatrends around the industry and developing countries. So first one is globalization. So no need to say. So especially I will highlight the GVC, global value chain. The second megatrend is Industry 4.0 or digitalization or fourth industrial revolution. So this happens in anywhere in the world, both developed countries and developing countries. Third one is most recently COVID-19, but I'd like to highlight not only COVID-19, but grouped as external shocks. So we need to be prepared for the future external shocks like COVID-19. So this is the area which I would like to talk. The fourth one is environment and social responsibility responses. This is also various issues are included, decarbonization, green economy. So I will go on. And actually, I have been working on both Africa and Asia in the last 2 decades on industrial development. So I'd like to talk both parts as much as possible. At first, so the globalization and global value chains. This is not necessarily new, but in the last 2 decades, it's growing rapidly. And especially most recently, it is highlighted from the aspects of development. So that's why World Development Reports taken up as most up-to-date issues in 2019, just slightly before the COVID-19. So fragmentation on the servicification. So these are often taken as the keywords. In any way, the GVC bring benefits from the development aspects for job creation and technology transfer, or capital inflow, and linkages, backward linkages, especially for the spillover effect to the local economy. So this is that means the GVC works for development. In donors interventions like JICA, so what we are doing is the cooperation on GBC in several countries, mainly in Asia, but not necessarily not only Asia, but the other continents. Especially we are highlighting from the GBC aspects, the parts and component industries. We sometimes call it supporting industries to produce parts and components and to supply to the assembler industries. So, and here from the aspects of industrial policy, as the previous speakers, both Professor Ono and Professor Amatsu suggested, horizontal and vertical are also here. The horizontal policy is very important, needed, how to make the investment reform or linkages through GBC, and vertical policies for the specific industries. This is also important. Now, second, the fourth industrial revolution, Industry 4.0. So this is something like buzzwords in the last perhaps 5 years or so. The fourth industries, it's about the smart application of the virtual and physical production systems. So, but what we should do this. The World Bank report summarizes what are the typical technologies. For example, in the IoT, I think this is most commonly taken up as a technology, Industry 4.0, Internet of Things, and also artificial intelligence, AI, 3D printing, robotics, smart sensors. I think these are the common technologies. Often we hear the voices about the Industry 4.0, especially about the skills. So the Industry 4.0 or robotics or these kind of AI or these kind of things may grab the human being jobs. A lot of concerns are here. Yes, some part of the physical and manual skills may be taken, but also at the same time, the more needs come up from the technological part or social and emotional part. So what is important is how to make a smooth shift, how to facilitate smooth shift of jobs from those the physical and manual skills to technological skills. So this is, it becomes very important. That's what is commonly discussed. In some Asian countries, especially the Southeast Asian countries, have been developing or developed in the last 2 or 3 years, so-called the Industry 4.0 type of industrial policies or national industrial policies. For example, Thailand developed Thailand 4.0. Indonesia developed Making Indonesia 4.0. Malaysia developed Industry Forward, so-called. So these are not necessarily talking about Industry 4.0 only, but it summarizes the impacts and how to integrate these into the national entire industrial policies. I don't go into details to talk about the details about this. JICA has been working on recently how to adopt, how to utilize this fourth industrial revolution or Industry 4.0 into the traditional development cooperation or industrial development. So it is some diagram. What is important is when we talk about the fourth Industry 4.0, perhaps what is most important at the beginning is the data-driven, how to take data digitally. So this is the first step. The second step is digitalization, how to make it into the system. And the third one is connectivity or network, how to link industries by digital. People tend to consider this first, but the first step is data-driven. So this is perhaps the easier steps. So and the cheaper steps to take. So this is very important. And so the Kaizen, I'm sure so many of you know that Kaizen is the Japanese approach for quality and productivity improvement. And this will be the talk in the 27th April, and the next, the same year. But we found that the affinity of Kaizen with the data-driven, how Kaizen itself is the data-driven approach. I will not talk in details, but this is just findings. Third part is, yes, about the COVID-19. Yes, the COVID-19, of course, it is has a very negative impacts. So industry heavily suffered by economic slump or huge demand loss, whatever. But also at the same time, they bring some the positive aspects. I don't know what we can say positive, but in anyway, so the digitalization has brought by or accelerated by this, and also Corona Tech, so-called, to solve the issues has been born, and homegrown solutions. This is also often referred. So JICA has been also working on this. Also, for example, from the aspects of investment, the step-by-step approach is taken, not necessarily bring a new investment, but retaining the existing investment. That is very important. That was, so retention aspects is more highlighted. Fourth one, environment and social. So this is too wide. So I just take up just one example. So to approach to provide solutions to social challenges. So the startup has very important because it is something like agile, flexible, innovative, provide many approaches. And so JICA has worked after the COVID-19 break to provide some called Project Ninja. This is next innovation with Japan, and to support the business plan. And so the various the solutions has taken up. Then I would summarize the opportunities. What we have seen, the globalization widen the chances, like the no need for full set basis for the industries like flying geese, but so partially the country can take part in the global value chain. So this is the provide the chances, opportunities. Likewise, digitalization also widen the chances. No need to say. Leapfrog is one of the way. And also burdens brought by external shocks create potential needs. This is what I have talked about, Corona Tech. Burden brought by social environmental responsibility also create new needs like green. So also at the same time challenges. These changes or needs need for another capacity development, new needs for capacity development. Also the complexity brought by these, so people or industry needs to consider these challenges at the same time. So it's very complex. And also less space for industrial policymaker, it could be, or maybe, we are not quite sure, due to increasing power of global platform M&A needs. So, so finally, the implications, that is megatrend, okay, sustainability, inclusiveness, and resilience. So these are the keywords which has been born from these megatrends. Speediness, yes, from the industrial policy aspect, the speed is more important than before to consider. A whole of government approach, because the things are very complex. And so not only the Ministry of Industry, for example, but whole of government needs to consider about the policies, industrial policies. Latecomers have now more chances to catch up, like leapfrog. So this is the things. And core learning, core solution. I think these are the keywords to survive under this industry, the new mega trends. We need to learn each other. We need to provide solution each other, not only developed countries, but the developing countries has more chance to provide solutions. So then accumulating these needs. So that these are the nature corresponds to the nature of translative adaptation. Translative adaptation is the is cross-cutting the key main topics of this book. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Homo, for a very interesting presentation on the expansion of both global value chains. You've spoken about the digital revolution and the industry 4.0. This is definitely a drive towards realizing inclusive and sustainable industrial development as it is embraced in both the Agenda 2030 and the African Agenda 2063. And thank you also for highlighting that the COVID-19 crisis also confirms the important role that industry plays in enhancing economic and social resilience. So thank you very, very much. In response to these very extremely well presented chapters, we would all like to thank Professor Ono, Professor Amatsu, and Mr. Homa, who have worked tirelessly and dedicated months of their time that we can have access to this knowledge today. So we thank you again very much. Now we will hear from our two discussants who will share their comments and analysis on the book. And I would first like to invite Dr. Jazini April, who is the coordinator of the BRICS Research Center at the Human Science Research Council in South Africa. Dr. Jazini, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thank Auda NAPIDS and the Chika Ogata Sadaku Research Institute for inviting me as a discussant for this joint book launch webinar today. This Chika publication on policy learning for industrial development, development and the role of development cooperation, volume 1, is indeed very timely as we pick the economic pieces due to COVID-19. However, even before COVID-19 in Africa, industrialization has remained a challenge due to various reasons. The fact is, industrialization, as the book highlights, is key for economic growth and development. Evidence shows that no country or region in the world has ever achieved prosperity and a decent socioeconomic life for its citizens without the development of a robust industrial sector. The book is very detailed and intensive with several key areas of discussion. So due to time, I'll not try to unpack and analyze all of them. I'm going to be selective with certain points. The first speaker, Professor Izumi Ono, through the broad overview, demonstrated how rich this book is and probably requires a full day conference to just unpack it. The book basically defines the characteristics of Japanese experiences of industrial development while drawing implications for facilitating translative adaptation in developing countries. Professor Ono demonstrates how the book examines industrial policy in regards to structural transformation of catching up economies. What I will tease out from her presentation is the issue of facilitating translative adaptation, which is critical from a continental perspective. The speaker, being Professor Ono, also defines translative adaptation as the process of adaptive acceptance of advanced systems and foreign cultures by developing countries on a broad scale. Professor Ono also emphasized the importance of local learning for industrial development. As a follow-up to this concept of translative adaptation, I would like to highlight that for decades, we have been on the receiving end, applying many Western standards from structural adjustments to the Washington Consensus, which the book mentions. There was never any translative adaptation, which is essential for industrial catch-up. There have to be learning and development processes that take place, which will not only influence the industrial policy content, but promote ownership. So I applaud the authors of this book for emphasizing this critical issue. While adapting to the global terrain, there's a need for global stakeholders that should take into account the country's specific conditions. In essence, for policy development, implementation, and industrialization to become a reality, developing countries need to enhance their policy capacity from both a global and local perspective that speaks to practical realities on the ground. The chapter by Professor Amatsu, on the other hand, is very fascinating to me. His presentation, as we saw, goes on into a broader aspect of industrialization, such as we saw with his discussion on the 4 mega trends, like the gap reduction process. But I'll refer to his discussion on the experience of the Meiji Japan era, which provides lessons for Africa. In order to contextualize this chapter, I had to do my own research on Meiji and discovered that he was the 122nd emperor of Japan, and his era was one which led the Japanese from feudalism to an industrialized modern state in the early 1900s. I discovered how Japan is the first non-Western industrializer, as the experiences of Meiji modernization and post-World War, the Second World War economic development are discussed in this book. Meiji Japan further provides examples where policymakers successfully managed the development process by selectively adopting foreign elements while retaining the basic structure of the indigenous society. Except for a few countries such as Botswana continentally, we adopted and we did not localize, which is really what this book has fleshed out. Through the experience of Meiji Japan, Amatsu also examines why some countries succeed in industrialization while others don't. Amatsu also summarizes the book's view well that industrial policies tend to be unrealistic and be state-driven, and that they should be reality-based with production sector view, which he highlights on the key points of his last slide. The third presentation by Mr. Toru Homa also discusses 4 mega trends surrounding today's industrialization, such as globalization, digitalization. I won't list all of them. But basically what Homa notes is that regardless of new trends, the basic nature and framework for industrial policy making remain unchanged. These include a proper mix of horizontal and vertical industrial policies. Homa also goes into Industry 4.0, detailed in his diagram, which concerns me in regards to the continental catch-up when you balance it with industrialization at a mass scale on the continent. How do we balance manufacturing, especially factory production for mass job production that would absorb unskilled labor versus your high-skilled 4.0 jobs that we saw on his slide? According to the African Development Bank study, Africa only cites skills or educational mismatches as a cause for higher youth unemployment, meaning that they cannot be absorbed into the 4.0 labor force. That is a problem we are currently facing in South Africa, which is into services at 4.0, but yet we do not have your large-scale industrial production that emanates from 1.0 to 2.0 to 3.0 levels to absorb the masses. So now, as you see in South Africa, high unemployment rests with the masses, not the elites. That said, moving along, I agree with Homa that if anything, COVID-19 has created a space for homegrown solutions and digital businesses amongst young people in particular, which could fit into the narrative of inclusive growth and development. The fact is we were forced to go digital the past 2 years. In closing, let me go back to the first presentation by Professor Onu on potential usefulness of Japanese experiences, the Industrial Catch-up and Development Cooperation, that we consider 2 methods or 2 industrial strategies. The first one being the Dynamic Capacity Development, DCD approach, which can help identify possible future paths unique to each region, in fact, unique to the entire continental region or to the countries. Country-wise, this is key because just as in the Democratic Republic of Congo alone, future paths for Lubumbashi, for example, would not be the same as in Goma, which is in the eastern part of the DRC, though and there are different provinces in the same country. They would have to be constructed differently. The ingredients approach, the second strategy, is also essential as the book details how it was built on real sector concern and joint work. Finally, I take note of the excellent case studies in the book on various countries such as Brazil, which are highly informative, not forgetting Japan's industrial policy support to countries such as Ethiopia. I also recognize the efforts to link with the AU Agenda 2063 and the AU Industrial Plan. In fact, I was glad to see on Professor Onu's reference on her presentation in regards to the African Free Trade Agreement, because that is definitely a major industrial project on its own, which could use some of the key lessons drawn from this book. Suffice to say, I'm glad that AUDA NAPIT is part of this process so that think tanks like ours can be exposed to this book. I also just have to mention chapter 6 is one of my favorites, as I enjoyed reading about the Okita report and its impact, which unfortunately I cannot unpack due to time. This whole book, ladies and gentlemen, is a treasure to have. So let me close by congratulating our honorable 3 presenters and the rest of the authors who are not with us today on an excellent book. And I definitely advise everyone to download a copy. Definitely our institution, the Human Science Research Council, will download it for the use of in our library. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jazini, for your time in reviewing the book and for highlighting how this book addresses the key factors for economic growth. Thank you very much for your time again. I now want to hand over to our second discussant, and I'm very happy to present Mr. Martin Bouwalia, who is the Director of the Knowledge Management and Program Evaluation Directorate here at the African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. Mr. Bouwalia, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pamela, the meeting director. And let me also add my thank you to the presenters and indeed the authors of the book. In the time available, I would like to go straight to my intervention and optimize as much as I can. And in that sense, I want to start by also acknowledging that the book is extremely timely from many angles. Of course, as our previous intervener has just said, the circumstances in the continent, in the whole world, would actually benefit greatly from such a book in terms of knowledge. But I also want to highlight that in the African continent, we have a number of processes that are actually underway as we speak that would greatly appreciate and benefit from intervention of the kind brought by this book. We have, some of you may be aware, that we are already preparing for the African Union Summit on Industrialization, which is already set for 20th of November 2022. We have a lot of discussions that are happening in the context of industrialization, whether from water security, energy security, that is meant to feed in the COP27 that actually Africa is hosting in Sharm el-Sheikh towards the end of the year. And indeed various other programs and efforts, including one on food systems that is actually also underway. So we have a space where this effort in terms of the knowledge generated in this book can actually reach the intended players and stakeholders in terms of informing decisions, informing actions that are necessary. And that actually also constitutes or defines the interest of the AUDA in this process and this event, as it were. We have a very clear responsibility about generating and deriving in knowledge, science, and connecting that to policy processes and connecting that to practitioners so as to inform decisions to ensure objectivity, realism, and practicality of the policies, development policies that we implement. I want to come straight to the subject of the book. When we talk about industrialization, I will not go specifically on the chapters. I want to offer some ideas around what would go in the mind of an African once reading this book. What are the insights that it generates? What is the thinking that is generated by virtue of actually interacting with this book? And that is where I also see the value of the book. I think our previous presenters articulated very well in terms of what is covered chapter to chapter. But let me speak now from the other angle of what comes to mind once you're reading this book as an African. The first issue is that obviously it's about lessons. It's about how the rest of the world, other than Africa, has gone about industrialization. And the first thing I learned there is that Africa has to find its own pathway. What we see in the book is actually an articulation of pathways in the Europe, in the Americas, in Asia, including Latin America, and things related to what were the triggers, what were the levers, what were the drivers, challenges, and opportunities actually keep coming up, whether it's actually policy issues, institutional issues, socio-economic issues. They are actually critical. And when you look at that, it immediately implies that Africa has actually got to define its own pathways. And what are the pathways is the clarity, the concreteness of what will drive in terms of levers, in terms of drivers, in terms of incentives, and even appreciating of what will be the disincentives, what will block, and how do you deal with the trade-offs that goes with a process of that nature. The second thing I see from reading the book that comes to mind is that there was one critical factor that can be noted as underlining the industrialization pathways, especially in the Europe and Americas, a little bit in Asia, is actually the link to the natural resource base. And here the issue is that the circumstances in general, and even probably specifically, that made industrialization to happen in the Americas, in the US, a little bit in Asia and Latin America, actually those circumstances, as it were, even if it's just 30 years ago, don't exist anymore. Things have changed and changed quite drastically in terms of the various key factors that can make or can hinder the industrialization that we like to see. And this again emphasizes the point that Africa has to come back to look at what are the circumstances, conditions, incentives within the today scenario. And it's not just the scenario in Africa, but the scenario globally, because, and I'll come back to this point, the advance of industrialization in Africa has to pay attention to what is happening in the rest of the world today, and that is the important part of making it happen. And lastly, in that context, I want to say that there are three things that are cardinal. The pathway is going to be uniquely African, but where we want to reach is where we can also see and learn from where is the rest of the world in terms of issues of generating national wealth. Of course, at the moment, we count that using GDP, other measures also. What about generating social and human well-being value? And if you come in Africa, you actually see that sometimes, and we had a period where we generated GDP, but they did not translate a lot of that GDP into social human well-being value. You also then look at how do you then adapt the capability to continue to industrialize in terms of human skills, in terms of institutions, in terms of policies. And this is the colleague was referring to when you talk about are we getting the skills necessary to feed and support the fourth industrial revolution. I want also here to say, and this is I have three segments. I'll conclude the first one here. I'm mindful of time. But is also the role that government played vis-a-vis business, vis-a-vis private sector. And here, and the interdependencies in that. And you find that what we have attempted to do in Africa in the last 10 years, 20, actually more than 10 years, you can talk about the last 3-4 decades, is actually an industrialization, what was going to happen largely at the back of development aid. And we know, I think I can boldly say it has failed. And therefore, we need to reconfigure that and look at, and I'm not saying industrial aid is bad, but I'm saying how does it actually play a role within a system that is business and government driven in terms of generation of national wealth and supporting human well-being. Then I come to my second segment of my intervention, is that as we look going forward, and this is again triggered by the book, when you read the book and looking at how do we exploit the opportunities that exist today, that Africa has to first and foremost begin with the articulation of a people-centered agenda. And even in terms of a long-term perspective of what do we want, and that is critical. And the book has acknowledged we have that now. We have that now in the form of Agenda 2063. And we need to come back to Agenda 2063 as the vision, long-term vision, but also articulating the key milestones that can enable us actually to move along that pathway or set of pathways towards what you may call industrialization. Sometimes I even think that Africa needs to find its own term that defines what we are looking for, because probably industrialization doesn't communicate what we are talking about in an African context. We also have the CFTA, again, another instrument that is very useful and the purpose built to enable us move. So we have a vision, we have a framework, and the instruments to actually get on a pathway that will generate wealth, generate human well-being in an African context and African specific. And what do I mean by African specific? I'm talking about a process, pathways, and ability to deliver that embraces the culture. I think that's what we talk about in Kaizen as well. The culture and traditions of the local systems, the institutions, the values and norms have to be part to that equation to deliver industrialization. It's not just investments, it's not just production and productivity. It is also the people factor. And Pamela, I'll conclude just shortly. So I identified, based on the book again, a number of what I would call conditions for success. How can Africa learn from this book, or based on this book, be triggered to actually examine and identify those conditions for success? One is that Africa has to come to terms with the regional industrial ecosystems. There is actually sustainable success at regional level. It's going to be complicated, it's going to be expensive at national level. So those systems and the mechanisms that can enable the continent build into what you may call regional industrial systems, value chains, have to be activated. The second thing is that we need to go back to the issues of unemployment, of some low performance in the critical human well-being aspects will be important to put up front, because you want the populations to run along, and they will run along when they understand the incentives and the benefits they will get in terms of livelihood benefits. So connecting any industrial policy has to be very clear about incomes in terms of jobs and entrepreneurship. And on entrepreneurship, I go to my third point, is about what will be the role of the small, medium enterprises. These are an important component of Africa in any way you look at it, and they are going to be part of the solution in terms of building competitiveness, viable business, as well as being relevant as small, medium enterprises to an economy that is continental, but also connected to the globe. My fourth point is about public service delivery, which is actually a challenge, and this is implied in the chapters of the book. Without proper articulation and the performance in terms of public service delivery, it may sound public, it is actually going to be a constraint to advancing on the industrial pathways. Another point is about risks, and here I want to refer to issues of climate. And Africa today has to deal with the issue of energy, issues of water security, and these are going to be and have been identified already as constraints in the process to industrialize. And we need a strategy as a continent, especially in terms of energy and the water security. And of course, issues of addressing the pandemics like we've seen in COVID. The presenter earlier was talking about COVID benefits. There is definitely silver lining, and there are some things that COVID has enabled us to realize and acknowledge, and therefore need to respond to. And Pamela, my last point is that connecting to even this event is that Africa has to recognize that knowledge is the resource. And to succeed is not just to pour money on it. And I think we are talking about think tanks, and this is what the African Union Development Agency is trying to say every day, is that one critical resource the continent already has is knowledge. And this book just comes in that space in terms of building this knowledge base that is going to make a difference in terms of advancing a uniquely African-specific industrial pathway, set of pathways, and therefore make a difference in the continent's economic growth and development. Thank you very much, Pamela. Back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Martin, for your ideas on the practical thinking of an African perspective and an African mindset. It was extremely valuable in speaking about the book from a practical approach, and you have definitely motivated us to think about the key points that you've mentioned as lessons and knowledge sharing in a practical, a people-centered way as a recipient for a knowledge based approach. So thank you very much for providing us also with an opportunity to use the contents of this book and to unpack the book at the AU Summit on Industrialization, which is scheduled for November this year. So thank you very, very much. Before I hand over to the authors to respond to some of the key points that was raised by both Mr. Bwalia and Dr. April, I would ask the audience to please post your questions either in the Q&A box or in the chat, or you're also welcome to raise your hand when we open the floor for questions. So if we will move on now to the authors, we can start by Professor Ono. If you have any response to the comments made by both our discussants. Thank you, Professor Ono.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate the really wonderful comments by Dr. Martin Bwalia and also Dr. Yazil Abil. I think I really appreciate that both you had a really deep reading of what we wrote about. So thank you so much. Let me talk also that I also read some in chat that a question from Mr. Inui about how maybe Japan could provide policy support to AFCFTA, and then so let me just think about those things too. So first is about the translative adaptation. I think that the April-san really kind of talk about how important it is in the African context, sharing experience of the structure adjustment operation time. And I think this is a really, I have a good maybe experience or lessons learned. So I really appreciate that is an important point. And also why translative adaptation is needed in the African context now, because as Martin talked about, Africa needs its own pathway for industrialization. Okay, this is my first point. At the same time, I think that Africa is diverse. So I think that Ethiopia, which may have a comparative advantage of the labor-intensive industrialization where I work, is quite different from like South Africa or other economies. And also some countries are mineral resource based, and also maybe Northern African countries are much more European part of the economic integrated. So when we think about that African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think that it is important to think about Africa as a whole. At the same time, we need to pay attention the maybe specific aspects of individual countries, what are the potentials, and also what are the maybe challenges to be overcome. This is where I feel like a translative adaptation thinking would be very useful. And also in terms of the maybe Inui-san's question regarding that FTF, I feel like maybe it is a bit difficult to generalize what maybe we could do for the policy support in general for that African Free Continental Trade Agreement. But I think JICA is providing support to the regional corridor development, for example. And then I think that would be one of the way when we look at the development corridors and how we can support that the potential of the development in the region by taking advantage of those infrastructure development and connectivities. That would be a maybe important, maybe one of the direction for the potential policy support. And also I want to mention that the regional integration have a maybe different types in Asia and Africa. In the case of Asia, it is based on the market-based regional integration. It is a de facto integration. Maybe in the case of EU, it started with a much more kind of the standardized way of the framework. So it's much more de jure. So I think we need both. But in the case of Africa, now you're working on that specific maybe detail about that much more legal framework and procedure, tariffs, etc. At the same time, it is also important to enhance industries and the capacity of the ingredient. Then that comes both. So when we think about the Continental Free Trade Agreement, how it works, I feel like both the country-specific that the approach and also corridor approach in looking at the potential around that the development potential would be very useful. So and then I also want to mention that maybe regional integration is a very important. So this is that maybe opportunity for you to start right now taking advantage of that African Free Trade Continental Agreement. At the same time, I think African export in the world share is very much limited, like a few percentage as I understand. So I think in parallel with working on the regional integration, it is also important to look into maybe global market, and each country has a different potential. So I think it is very important to work in both sides, and this is how maybe I hope African can find out its own pathway through translative adaptation perspective. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Ono. Professor Amato, I give you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. So Dr. Giardini and Mr. Buaria, thank you very much. So Dr. Giardini could summarize every presentation very well, and Mr. Buaria. So yes, I like your points. So Africa may need to pursue your own way for industrialization. That's a very impressive comments. But probably so Japan and also Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, this is a catch-up type industrialization towards Western countries. Right? Therefore, basically their industrialization is manufacturing-oriented industrialization or catch-up. Therefore, so some of African countries may be able to follow this path, but some others may not be able to follow this path. It depends on each country or each country conditions. You're right. Therefore, in the latter part, so some of African countries may need to pursue their own way. They need to look for it. But frankly speaking, this is not easy task for every African countries and also African Union, I think. In that sense, so very basic point here is to let growing industry grows naturally. That's very important. Then, so what kind of environment can government prepare or create for those growing industry? That's a very basic point. To that purpose, probably government side or ministry in charge need to look at those growing industry and listen to their voices very carefully, and so make best effort to create those environments. But to do that, so government need to be able to talk with those growing industry with common language and common knowledge, common logic. Therefore, they need to study industry. Therefore, so some part within the government should have some organizational settings which accumulate enough knowledge about the industry. That's a very important point. Thank you very much. But not easy task.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Amatsu. We are running out of time. I'm going to allow Mr. Homa to quickly provide his response. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pamela-san. Yes, it's very limited time, so I just make very concise as possible. So thank you very much for both Dr. April and Mr. Varias, your valuable comments. And I like your words, like the people-centered agenda in Africa is taking. So it is very important. So from that aspects, the AFCFTA is very the important the attempt, and we try to follow this as much as possible. And the JICA has been working on the survey or how to support this work, and so bringing the ASEAN's experience as the benchmarking. So as Professor Ono suggested, that there are some the differences with EU approach, but in the case another yes lessons or from ASEAN's experience is it takes time. So step-by-step approach is very important. So and also taking care of the latecomers among the latecomers, yes. And so ASEAN is the case of ASEAN is also not the common. There are many parts of common, but many parts is different in terms of development stage. So I think that is the same with the African case. So that is the aspects which we need to take care of, and also SMEs, very important, and entrepreneurship. So that in that sense, so we very much looking carefully to support for startups. So those are the hopes, and so they are taking the innovations, bringing innovations. And so regarding the innovation skills or Industry 4.0 type skills, digital skills, so those startups as some advantages. So they are very flexible to utilize the digital skills. And so when we say the Industry 4.0 type of the technology or skills, those are not necessarily high level, which you cannot take easily. Rather than that, those Industry 4.0 type technology makes the high technology unlock for everybody. So that's in that sense, there are a lot of the chances, opportunities to take up. And actually, so there are a lot of leapfrog cases happen in Africa. So most famous one is, everybody knows the M-Pesa case. So that actually Japan cannot take, Japan is far behind the M-Pesa's yes, advantage in the digitalization, digital money or the platform. So anyway, so there are a lot, it is very important to associate with the African uniqueness of practical. So I agree to have more practical the research surveys along with Africa. So important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Homa. In the interest of time, I know that Professor Ono had addressed very briefly, but for the audience, I will just read out a question that was posted by Mr. Inui-san, and it says, many African countries cannot cannot have sufficient economies of scale due to having a small market access or penetration in individual countries. Therefore, the implementation of the African Free Trade Agreement is crucial to promote African industrialization and to compete in the world market. In this regard, is there any possibility to provide policy support from JICA to realize the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? If yes, what support can be expected both from Japan and Africa? I know Professor Inu has touched on this, that we might not have all the answers at this platform. However, from the response of Mr. Bawalia on the points that he had made and the response that Mr. Homo has just picked on regarding small-scale enterprises and entrepreneurship, I think we can work together to realize some of these policy decisions that we can take forward very concretely from this platform. So I would leave that question. I want to just go on to questions that were posted on the chat. And one recipient has explained a lot on the just transition supporting learning as mentioned. However, the gain on skills so many times to adopt uncertainty is still proposes difficulties like changing completely different skills in a later age. I'm for sure they're speaking about the age gap or feeling damage. Skill learning, especially social and emotional skills, have risks to harm mental or affected social norms. So Mr. Homer, I think this is directed mainly on saying that from Kaizen field seems realistic, but it sounds different from leapfrogging direction. And the question is, what would it combine by widening the base of education and research donation? And in that case, would it be advantageous to place it at international trade and the global value chain? I hope I have done justice to that question. It was really packed concretely, but basically they speak about the age gap and the skills sets there and how international trade and global value chains will be an advantage to this. So Mr. Omo, if you'd like to just quickly expand on that response, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. So actually, I cannot read all. I'm still reading, but anyway, yes, some sort of agree. So it is not necessarily. Yes, it is not easy to match both the widening the education skills and also for the making the transition to high skills. But anyway, so the Kaizen seems to be the different approach, what the question said. But what we found is Kaizen can be a link, and Kaizen is the gateway for digitalization. And Kaizen makes the easier for getting data. Kaizen is born from the approach for statistical quality control. Kaizen's the important thing is how to get data, how to make data available and share with everybody. So this is the basic the understanding of Kaizen. So this directly connects to the digitalization world. So this is digitalization, how to link the physical and virtual by digital. So this is the most important part of the Industry 4.0. So I think the Kaizen can be a link, not the different things. And so I just want to say like that. And also others, so I'd like to follow later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Homo. Thank you. I have two quick questions before we move to the closing session. And this question I will pose to Professor Amatsu. Since ownership seems important in this approach, how do you secure inclusiveness, accountability, and so on the recipient country ownership? If you would like to attempt to answer that question, please. Thank you.
Okay, so each country design and implement the industrial policy or industrial related policies, of course, as this person says, so ownership is very important. But sometimes, so if ownership is too much strong, maybe they may have some risk. For example, if that is the person with a goodwill and good sense, yes, so that can make the economies in the good direction. But if the person in charge is not such kind of people, but policy framework will be distorted, right? Politically, economically, their own interests. In that sense, so how accountability mechanism or transparency mechanism can be built in those policy making decision process, implementation process. That's also very important. Inclusiveness as well. So how you can building those mechanisms internally within the government and out externally outside the government. So cross-check types, that is very important. In that sense, so government also need to make efforts for nurturing some knowledge societies outside the government. Society capability.
Thank you.
Both.
Thank you, Professor Matsu. I'm going to hand the last question to Professor Ono.
Okay.
And the last question is, how do you consider the movement of people, both inner and inter countries, when making industrial policy? So
I see.
yeah,
This is
yeah.
a very challenging question. But before that, let me just compliment Matsu-san said that I think it's very important to strengthen the private sector's capacities, and also including the private sector business association as a voice for maybe kind of disseminating the needs of their the needs. Then this will also counter to the maybe accountability part for co-creating each other with the government for the direction of industrial development. Okay, so the real question of the human movement, okay, this is a very challenging issues. Maybe in terms of external, maybe the movement, as we really witness a lot, and also this African free trade continental agreement may eventually maybe address those labor movement too. So this is a tremendous maybe impact how the country should develop its maybe wealth. So industrial policy may not be limited to the even one country, but still, and then that means that the maybe remittance becomes very much important, and then building human capability becomes even more important. Yeah, at the same time, I'm still thinking at the basic the building industrial basis within the countries is very important, because it will create job, and also it will create a linkage to the domestic industry, and also the maybe that the link to the global market for the competitiveness. So if you would like to maybe enrich the countries, it may be also possible to kind of do that the remittances, the revenues, by improving the capability of human resources. Maybe Philippines is one of the maybe example. They have been successfully skilled people, and they work in many countries in overseas. At the same time, I understand that they continue to face that the needs for overcoming middle income traps. I think their per capita income is now being surpassed by Vietnam, for example. So I think that taking advantage of this labor movement, migration, at the same time, building industrial bases within the country is continuously very important because it will have a spillover effect in various ways. So this is my tentative maybe answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ono. I want to thank all of you for your responses in this very short time. There were some difficult questions, but I know we have done justice regarding the response to that. Now the stress is between the closing remarks that will be made and the time we will finish. So I want to take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Hamada-san, who is the Deputy Director General and Executive Senior Research Fellow at the JICA Ogata Research Institute for Peace and Development. Mr. Yamada-san, over to you to do the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Pamela-san. As a Deputy Director General of JICA Ogata Research Institute, and also as one of the authors of this new book, I would like to thank all of you for attending this launch event. Around 60 participants, we welcome 60 participants, and in order to, in addition to that, so we welcome very good, great discussants, Dr. April and Mr. Bualuya, and also Ms. Palma. Thank you very much for your very excellent moderation. And also I'd like to thank all the presenters from our research team, because we are co-organizing this event with Policy Bridge Tank of Auda NEPAD. I would like to claim that our new book, or the event like today, is also something that serves as a bridge in several meanings. So first, the book bridges Japan and our partner countries, in today's case, African stakeholders. So the exchange between Japan's experiences and the very useful feedback based on African reality enriched the discussion. Thank you very much for that. And also second, we wanted to connect academicians and practitioners. This is coincides with what Mr. Bualuya said, but from the very beginning, our authors were thinking about contributing to the practitioners, especially the policy makers in developing countries. So today's event is really what we wanted to do. And the third thing is we also wanted to bridge past and future. So as Ahmad-san's presentation suggested, so it is very important to learn from past experiences, but that is not enough. That must be accompanied by the proper understanding of the contemporary issues as suggested by Honma-san to come up with a new future policy direction and also cope with a very changing landscape surrounding the industrial development. So I hope through this kind of bridge function of today's event, I really hope we could provide you participants with something useful that help your learning or translative adaptation. But at the same time, I'd like to emphasize our research team really learned a lot from very insightful comments from the commentator and the questions from the floor. And so this is really the process of mutual learning, and this leads to knowledge co-creation. And so actually our research is still evolving. The book we published this time is just the intermediate output, and building upon today's discussion and more to come. We are expecting to publish another final book in the next fiscal year. So in that sense, we really look forward to delivering more of our research findings in due course. And apart from this research, another thing I wanted to highlight is that today's event is a really good start of the institutional collaboration between Auda NEPAD Policy Bridgetown and also JICA Ogata Research Institute. So I learned by tying up together, we could deliver very diversified expertise, and also that can be delivered to a very wide range of stakeholders, both in Africa and in Japan. So in that sense, we'd like to explore the further possibility of collaboration between the two institutes. And in this connection, so I'm glad to announce the next round of collaboration event is already underway. And later, I believe Pamura-san will provide you with the more detailed information. So I hope to see many of you online again in this coming event. So once again, thank you very much for participating in and also contributing to today's very meaningful event. Thank you very much. So over to you, Paloma-san.
Thank you very much, Mr. Yamada. That was a really good and comprehensive wrap up to today's session. I personally enjoyed the exchange of knowledge, the learning and the unification of ideas. And in my opinion, this is true development. So thank you very much as well. We thank you all, our participants, our guests, our presenters, our discussants, for the time that you have made in joining us today. And we wish to remind you, as you see on your screen, the launch of the second book titled Promoting Quality and Productivity Improvement, the Kaizen in Africa Experience. And this is scheduled for the 27th of April. And we do encourage you to register for this launch. Thank you very much. And we wish you a good day and a good evening if you're joining from Japan. Thank you very much and goodbye.